So let's start out with the challenges to your business. What we hear the most often is there's a challenge with time and efficiency or with reporting. Now keep in mind, these challenges can be with a time-only license, an expense-only license, or all the way up to our portfolio license. What people tell us is that they're not sure how to make mass changes using Unanet data. So if they need to change labor category for 100 people, how can they do that quickly without going into each individual person, for example? How can they alleviate the duplication of data entry? So if you don't currently have an interface set up, you may be entering data, your people are entering time in Unanet, and then you're creating a report and you're going in and manually putting in time or expenses or any of that information into your payroll system or your accounting system. There are ways to alleviate that manual process, and we're going to talk about those today. The other is data validation between systems. So any time that you're doing that manual process for data entry, there is a chance for error. So by having a streamlined process where the systems are speaking to one another, you reduce greatly the percentage of errors with your data. And then finally, accidental duplication, where maybe you have two administrators working on different things and they've duplicated something, or even just one particular person that you enter data in twice and how to validate which is correct. So we're going to talk about that. And the other we're going to talk about is reporting. One of the things that we hear all the time on the CAM side when we're discussing things in our account reviews is people that don't have integration with systems, oftentimes the project managers are unable to see all of their project's financials. So they may be able to run a project actual summary report and see actuals for time, but they can't actually see burden costs or what the overall picture of that project looks like. And so what they're called to do is lean on their accounting department, ask for a report, and a lot of the times what will happen is they'll get a report that was closed out on Friday, it's now Wednesday, and the information that was in that report is no longer valid. And what Unanet allows you to do, the beauty of Unanet, is to give you vision and insight into your reports or into your projects in real time. So if you have data being processed back and forth between systems, then project managers and other people in the organization that do not have access to accounting are now able to see that information. So I've talked about the challenges with your business that you may encounter not having integration or interfaces set up. And I'm going to turn this over to Christiane to talk about how to alleviate these challenges.
Okay, great. Thank you, Holly. So we've encountered in the services team, we're working with the Unanet customers as well as the customer account management team, these same challenges. And the Unanet interfacing capability will allow you to go through and take advantage of some opportunity to be able to resolve these issues. So when you're using an integration capability from Unanet, what that's doing for you is it's giving you the comfort to know that the data with Unanet and your downstream systems are consistent. So we're trying to get that data to match up and always be consistent. We're also helping many of our customers that are using an interface to shorten their payroll and their reimbursement cycles. So by having data entry migrating from Unanet into a payroll system, directly into an accounting system, it's really shortening that time frame that it takes to get the payroll out the door and to get employees reimbursed for expenses. Many of our customers are using Unanet as the hub for all of this information. So by having a single source, a single area to go out and look at all of that information, we'll know that that is quality data. It's consistent across the different applications within the company, and we'll know that it's a good hub for all of that information. And the real reason why you want Unanet to be the hub of this information is because everybody's using Unanet anyway. Everybody's going in to create their timesheets and fill out their expense reports. So it's the one place for all of that data. And if you have it in your system, then your project managers have the ability to get those real-time reports and looking at their project financials in a much quicker way because they can see that information in Unanet. Many of our clients are taking advantage of interfaces that are automatically scheduled so that there's no manual intervention between that external system and their Unanet system. So we're going to talk a little bit today about that automatic scheduling to prevent that manual intervention. And the last thing that we're going to want to focus on is how you can avoid the duplication of data entry from one system to another and avoid those mistakes that Holly mentioned as a part of the problem. So let's take a look at the interfaces that we currently have available today. I have up on the screen here a slide that shows many accounting systems that we're currently integrating with for many of our customers. Up at the top of the screen in the dark green color, I've highlighted a couple of systems that we do have a standard built interface that's a bi-directional interface. The QuickBooks box over on the top right is shaded for you because we do have a standard integration currently that's feeding data from Unanet into QuickBooks, and we're working on developing a process that would take QuickBooks information and bring that to Unanet. But all of these systems are things that we've integrated with from an accounting perspective. I'll bring in a look at some of the systems that we're currently integrating with that are payroll systems, and we also have the ability to integrate with corporate card companies, with corporate cards to bring in transaction data to Unanet that your employees can integrate into their expense reports. So all of these things are things that Unanet customers are using and really helping their companies to improve the processes and improve that data information in the Unanet system. So while we're talking about interfacing, let's make sure we're all using the same terms. So we know we have Unanet, which is displayed on the left, and you know that you have some kind of other systems in your company. You probably have an accounting system, you have a payroll system, an HR system, you have all these other systems. So when I'm saying the word export, what I'm talking about is being able to transfer data from Unanet into one of those other systems. So it's a process of taking that Unanet data and feeding it out or exporting into that system. And we also have the other direction defined as well, where you can take data from your accounting system, your payroll system, format it into an applicable formatting tool, and then import that data into Unanet. So we're going to be talking about both the exports and the imports during today's webinar. I'm going to start off the conversation by focusing on the export side. So when you want to take data that is in Unanet and send it out somewhere else, you'll need to have within your Unanet system an export defined. The export function allows you to really do two things. The first thing that allows you to do is to take data in Unanet and send that out to integrate with another system. And the other thing you can do is the first bullet point here on this slide is to take Unanet data out, modify it, and then bring it back into the Unanet database. So making those updates on standard and existing data. We are going to later in the presentation go through a sample, and I'll show you how that type of interaction works. With the integration to another system, we do have a number of options when you're creating an export template that would allow you to build data into either a CSV, which is a comma separated value file, or a fixed file format, and you can use logic to calculate or derive information to send out in an export as well. So you don't necessarily have to send straight Unanet fields to other system fields. You can derive or calculate what those fields would be. So let's talk about this first option, which is exporting Unanet data out of Unanet and importing it into Unanet again to make some kind of update. In your Unanet system, the administrators will have access to a number of import templates. They are located under the admin dashboard in the export submenu. And we will go into Unanet a little later on today, and I'll demonstrate where that's located. The top half of this slide shows a list of sample import templates that we have standard in every Unanet system. The import templates are available for you to export data into that table format. The screen at the bottom half shows what an export template screen looks like, where you would logically export data and download from the red circle the file that results from your export. Those files will all be set up in a comma-separated value, or CSV file, that you can then manipulate and modify in Excel and then be able to import back into the system. We have found that this is an excellent tool for many of our customers to be able to use when they do need to update system data, as Holly referred as an example, something like updating a labor category for a number of employees, modifying the default project configuration, perhaps to support things like requiring comments on a timesheet. You can export all of your projects, make that single change and bring it back in, setting in new dates for your projects, things like that. The other thing you can do with an export template is you can build your own export template in order to be able to pull data out into a format that you would like to see. So these import templates do have a file specification, which we'll also take a look at a little later. You do have the ability to create your own export template. So when you're trying to get started with building your own export template, there's a couple of things that you'll need to do your homework first. The first thing that you need to do is you need to understand what your specifications are. So you need to know if you would like to create a spreadsheet using that CSV file format, or if you need to create a fixed length file. You'll need to understand if you require in that output some kind of header, any type of subtotals or groups, because that will define ultimately what your export template looks like. And then you'll also need to define what is going to be included in that export. So you'll need to ask if there's any static values that you need to have included in that export. If you have a specific field mappings with Unanet information, and what are those field mappings? Are there calculated fields, and what's the formula in order to calculate that field value? And are there any fields that you would have to derive or logically produce? And if so, how would we know? What would we know? How would Unanet know how to derive that information? So thinking about building your own export does require that you're doing your homework and thinking through what you specifically need to have in order to get started. When you are working in the export template area, a couple of things to keep in mind is that you will have to define your template type, and the template type will be the basic database view that you're choosing to look at. So from a very simple perspective, if you're wanting to create a spreadsheet file that shows the number of hours that that a group of individuals have worked on a series of projects, because you want to pull time data, your basic template type would be time, and that's the database view that we would be pulling that information from. Many of the database views that you select when you get started will include multiple views within that same type. So, for example, if you are going to create an export that does pull time data, that would include the database views also to the person, the project, the task, everything that's related to time data. So you're able to not only pull the actual time, but related to that, the people, the projects that they're working on, etc. You'll need to choose, as I mentioned before, what type of file format you're looking to get from this template. So in my scenario, I said that I wanted to have a spreadsheet type view of this information. So I could create a simple CSV file, which is a file that you can then open in Excel. You can open and edit in the CSV file editor, but it basically creates a spreadsheet. Fixed file formats are traditionally needed for other more stringent integrations where the receiving system is looking for a fixed length of every field in your file output. And then lastly, when you're starting with an export template, is you need to identify those fields to use in your file. So we have within the Unanet system a field chooser that allows you to go out from the database views that you've included in your template to choose the various fields that you need to include. So again, with my scenario, I've thought about bringing out a spreadsheet with time data for each person, what projects they've worked on. So I would need to choose the fields for the person's name, probably the project code, things like that. Holly mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that your customer account manager is the appropriate person to contact if you have any questions about getting started with export templates. We do have a series of standards that we have available here at Unanet based on years of working through export templates for various systems. So if you do have a need to integrate with an external system, please contact your customer account manager or that CAM at unanet.com email address so that you can get a copy of a standard template at least as your starting point to work from. Now you'll notice that once you have a template, and we will go take a look at a template in just a little while, when you have one of your Unanet templates, they do contain what we call export expressions. And export expressions give you the ability to not only pull a field of data from your database view, but also then to logically determine how to make that field behave in your output. So for example, we have many different decision operations that you can incorporate into your export expressions, things like using an if-else logic statement to determine if a value is set, what to do with that data, or if not, if then, what to do with the data. We also have the ability for you to use operations like switch and case statements. We have some string operators to be able to string together or parse data using the concat statements or the substring operators that allow you to parse together, parse out data from a specific field or concatenate together multiple fields into a single line of your export. The export templates do include a number of numeric operators so that you can perform math and other calculations of the data that you're hoping to export from the system. And finally, we include in our export expressions a number of formatting options for things like the dates, the number, currency, etc. So if you do require specific formats of the data that you're exporting, we can accommodate those things through a formatting option. Over on the left here, I did include in this PowerPoint presentation a link to the help documentation for the export expression area. And I chose a sample from the help documentation, which I know is very small to read on your screen, but on the concat operator. In the help documentation, we do have an explanation of each one of our export expressions and a sample of how that's used within the system using fields. The example on this slide here is concatenating together the person last name field and the person first name field and separating those fields with a comma and a space. So things like that that can help you format that data in your export template will make your resulting file much more user-friendly, easier to read, and able to help you get the data out that you're really looking for. I have worked at Unanet for over 5 years, and when I create export templates, I still look at the help documentation for export expression assistance fairly frequently. So I think that that's a very valuable tool, and I would encourage you to use that tool as you're building exports or learning about them yourself. So that's the basic setup for an export. So let's talk about the import side a little bit. So when you're thinking about bringing data into your Unanet system, you'll want to think about how you can format that data to import into Unanet. All of the imports that we have coming into the Unanet database are facilitated through a standard CSV, comma separated value, file format. So we essentially will take any spreadsheet of data that you have, if saved in CSV format, to import to Unanet. There are specific configurations that are required for that import file, but they do allow you to add data to the Unanet system, to modify existing information, and under some circumstances to delete data from the Unanet database. The standard layout is defined by data element. So when you want to import data into Unanet, the first thing that you need to identify is which table or tables in Unanet would contain that information, and then to understand the standard layout that will allow you to import the data into those tables. This is also where you can perform those mass data modifications. So if you used an export template to export some Unanet information, you want to reconfigure that information in a spreadsheet, then you can use the import tool to bring it back into Unanet to make those updates. So, it sounds exciting, but what kinds of data can be imported to Unanet? This list is a list of all of the different tables that we have available for you to import into the Unanet database structure using this standard CSV file layout. So there are a number of different options that you'll have to be able to interface and bring data into the Unanet system. You'll also see that some of the tables seem to go together. So for example, if you're thinking about doing update to your people and you want to be able to bring in information about your employees, the standard person profile page is all imported into our person table. But in addition to that person table, we also have information like person accruals, a person's accrual starting balance and their association with accrual plan. That's a separate table and it's a separate import. And also our person skills area. If you're maintaining a skills profile for each one of your users, you can import that information to Unanet, and that's also managed through a separate import. And those three different person imports do have their own specifications, and you would be importing into each one of those separately. Now, included in this list, but maybe not as obvious as some of the items listed here, are some additional information that we do have customers importing information into Unanet on a regular basis. The first is the credit card transaction import area. What this allows you to do is take from your credit card company and import transactions so that employees can see those transactions in their expense report and reconcile them into the appropriate project and expense report where that corporate card expense was made. And we have some really great reports on unreconciled credit card expenses that the administrators of the system can see, and also some reports on those reconciled transactions so that you can more easily reconcile your credit card statements. This type of functionality does use our expense reporting module, and the project expense, project tracking, and project portfolio licenses would allow you to import this credit card information. We do have additional webinars that are available to you that have been previously recorded about our expense module. So if you have any questions about that functionality, we'd be happy to direct you to some additional information. Another imported option are the other project costs. And Holly mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, one of the business challenges that we frequently have that we work with on our customers is the ability for a project manager to really see all the project costs on their projects. And so we do have an interface called the other direct costs, or you can think about it as the other project costs, that would bring information in from your accounting system for those costs on those projects. Typically, we're importing that data into the Unanet expense template area, and we actually bring these expenses in as an expense report that's loaded under a single user account like the administrator account or one of your project manager accounts. We would identify these expenses as company paid so that they're not impacting your reimbursement totals or any interaction with your reimbursement cycle, but they are there as a placeholder or an entry so that you can see this as costs as your project. If you're interested in implementing something like an other direct costs or other project costs interface, you would need to set up expense types to categorize those costs and to be able to show those in the reports to your project managers so they can easily identify what those costs are. And then you also want to take a look at any integrations that you currently have from Unanet into other systems, your exports from Unanet to those other systems, to ensure that we're not taking out this information and putting it back into your accounting system. Now, we do have a standard other direct costs interface from source data from Deltek and from Dynamics SL that integrates this information automatically to Unanet. So if either one of those systems are your accounting systems, then please contact us and we can certainly help you establish this interface. For other systems, we have worked through ways to be able to get this information to come into Unanet, and we'd be happy to explore with you how that external system can format the data so that we can import it to Unanet. So this all sounds fantastic, and now my next question is, well, where do I find this information? How do I know what your formats are in order to be able to import this data? So again, I've included in this PowerPoint presentation a link to the import specification document within our Unanet help documentation. So we do list in the help documentation a complete import specification for every table that we showed on that bulleted list just a couple of slides ago of data that you can import to Unanet. And that includes information about fields that are required, the field formats, what information you'll need to have in order to import that data. A couple of other questions that you may be asking yourself about Unanet imports are, do you require a header field? What fields are required? How do I get all this information together? So just a couple of notes about that. When you're importing data into Unanet, we do not require that you have a header record. But if you do have a header record, we will read that as part of the import file. So if you're not able to create a header record from your external system and you want to import a field into Unanet, a file into Unanet, your header, your file format would need to file our interface standard. If you can create a header, we will read specific header requirements, and each one of the header records would use a standard field layout that we have in the import specification, and the first field in that import file would include an asterisk in the header record so that we would know to read that as a header. As far as what fields are required, this actually does change based on the type of information that you are importing. We do have fields that are always required when you're importing information into Unanet, and again, that varies by the type of data that you're importing. And then we'll have some fields that are conditionally required, and that means that based on other configurations that you have within the Unanet product, you may have set something to be required in your system, so then those fields would also be required. So for an example of that, if you're going to import a person record into Unanet, the person username is always going to be a required field. Whether you're adding a new person or you're going to be updating an existing person record, that person username is that key connection to the user's record. You may have configured in your database person user defined fields and made those fields required, in which case then, if that's the case, when you import a person, you would also have to include those fields. So that's what we mean by conditionally required versus always required. And the last item to note is that our file formats for importing are always a comma separated file or a comma delimited file format. You will always need to ensure that your data does come available in a comma separated file format in order for us to import it into Unanet. Now that in and of itself occasionally does create a little bit of an issue when pulling data from another system. So if you're working with a comma delimited format, a couple of tips here. The first is that you can enter data that is comma separated that you're trying to import into a single field into double quotes, and that, just as a note, CSV files, if you open them in Excel, they do strip out leading zeros to data fields. So if you do have zeros in your data fields, you may need to use a CSV file editor to bring that in. The other information that I'll note on this slide here is that I'm showing in the center of the screen a sample of a spreadsheet that's something that I might want to import, and you'll notice the header record is in row 1. That record does have a header, and I can see the asterisks in column A, which indicates that that's the start of your header record, and then I'm using a standard naming convention that comes from our import specification to identify the individual field names that I'm including in my header. Okay. The import specification also includes some special tags that you can use when you're updating existing Unanet data. So if you have Unanet data in the database but you'd like to update that information, these tags can be used in your import file in order to update that information. We have the delete tag, update, blank by removing the data value there and leaving the field blank, and then renaming. All of the import records are processed using standard validation routines. So as you're importing data, particularly updates to existing information, we will be validating that as it's imported into the system. Any errors that are reported will show on the screen. We will describe why that record is erroring out, and then we'll also put that information into a file that you can then go and correct. As we're importing data, we do read each row or each record of your file separately, and we'll import the information that we can and then reserve or put off that information that we can't import due to that validation. So the next question in my mind then is, well, how do I get all of this information imported? I'd like to put together this file. I want to automate my imports so that I don't have to think about this import regularly. So we do have a couple of different options for you to import data into Unanet. We do have the import facility available through the user interface, and I'll show you that here in just a few minutes. The user interface will allow you to bring in data manually if you're an administrator in the Unanet product. We also have customers using what we call a command line interface, which imports information through a command line setting. And finally, our integration management utility, which we'll be talking about today, allows you to import information into Unanet on an automated schedule. So within the user interface of Unanet, when you have information that you'd like to export from Unanet, the user interface does have an export function which generates the CSV or fixed file format, and then you can take that and manually then enter it into one of your external systems like accounting, payroll, or HR. This is an example of an export template. This template was designed to be able to take time data and labor category information from Unanet and enter that time data into QuickBooks, and then also generate from that a service item in the QuickBooks database. So from one record out of Unanet, we're able to pull in a number of pieces of information into Unanet. When you're running an export from the Unanet system, what you're doing is you're presented with a screen that allows you to choose what data you're trying to pull and information that you're trying to pull. Now, one of the main keys when you are exporting data from Unanet is to avoid this possibility of sending data to the other system multiple times, particularly when you're exporting time data or expense data. So for our time data exports, we do have a number of keys that I'll point out here as you're exporting time data. The first is that we do recommend that you're always pulling your time sheet data using a specific time period. So you're pulling the data by time period. And also highlighted in yellow on this screen is the link to show and mark your data as extracted. And what that will do is it will change your timesheet status from completed into a locked or extracted status, and that is the indicator flag that you have used and moved that data to another system. When you run your exports for time, typically you're taking out just your completed timesheet information, so you're taking data from a completed timesheet. And once it is extracted, it changes that status so that you will not accidentally take that data back out of the system and import it into your external system for a second time. And then lastly, highlighted in yellow at the bottom of this screen is the adjustment area, where if you're pulling time data for that specific time period, you can also in the same file bring out your adjustments for any external adjustments that were made during that same period. After you've created this criteria screen, you do have the option to save the criteria screens, and we would recommend that you create a standard saved criteria that you can execute over and over again. And all of our automated export tools, like the integration management utility, will be looking for saved exports. So that will help you to ensure that your saved export follows the same standards every time you run it, and that you don't forget to check a box or forget to set something in it. But once you run your export, then you'll have the ability to see that exported file, you'll be able to download it, and finally you'll take that file that results from this export process and move it into your external system, something like QuickBooks, so that you can import it into that system. I do have within my Unanet system here, I'm going to switch screens a little bit on you, an example of a Unanet screen that does have an export template area. So I got to this screen by going to my admin dashboard and going to the export template area. The export template area in my system has a number of standards. Yours, of course, wouldn't have all of these templates, but you do have in your export template menu these import templates. So these are the templates that you can use to export information from Unanet into a CSV file format. So you can actually take data that's in the Unanet system and export it into another system. Based on the types of integration that you are working on, you may also have additional templates that have been designed for you from one of the Unanet consultants to be able to pull data into a format that one of your external systems requires. If I look for an example of an export template, this QuickBooks template shows an example of a record that includes both a header record. So in this case, QuickBooks does require a header. The header is defined by the external system. So I'm putting in here all the fields that my external system requires in the format that they require for the header. And then my detail record is where I actually identify the files that the fields, that I'll be pulling from Unanet. Any word that we have in quotes is just a static field. So this is just printing out this text within the header record. The header records here, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., do create the columns across the top of your resulting spreadsheet. And then the template area and the detail record is where all of my fields are loaded so that I know what information I'm pulling from Unanet. Again, the idea of a standard text information that's never going to change, a single Unanet field that allows me to pull the data from that specific field to include in that column for each row. And then some of these also show examples of our logic-based settings. So for example, if my task field here is blank, then I'll pull the project field. Otherwise, I'll pull the tasks field. This is an example of a logically derived statement to know what information to pull from the system. I have a couple of examples in here of a sum where I'm summing together the total hours worked, etc. Back to my slide here. When we're talking about importing data, we also have within the user interface the ability to import information from that external system if you've created a CSV file using our import specifications that you can then bring in through the user interface to Unanet. Here's an example of an import file. This is just the spreadsheet that I have in Microsoft Excel, but maybe from my HR system I've been able to pull together a skills list, skills matrix of all the different skills that the employees in my company have that I want to include in Unanet. So from this spreadsheet, I've added in a header row, row 1, that shows the header that Unanet would use to import this information. And then I can see in my Unanet screen under the admin dashboard, there's an import submenu. I'll choose the type of import. In this case, it's a skills import. I'll just identify and point right to this file, and then I'll import this information. And once I've imported the file, then I can see that information within the user interface in that field. So here's the skills list that came from that imported file. You can then go back to that file and add additional information. So here I have this same file. Now I've just added a couple of new skills that maybe have been added to my HR system. By having this template, if you will, with the header record of the different field values and the different information that I want to import, when I save this file and go into my Unanet system, again, under the admin dashboard and in the import submenu, I can come in using all of the different types of records that I can import, go to my skills, choose that file, and bring that data right into Unanet. And as I described earlier, when you do import data to Unanet, we will write out a record with any errors that we find so that you can make those modifications in your spreadsheet and then import them back into Unanet. The key to importing data into Unanet is to ensure that your file does include all of the required fields, information from the header is necessary, and that you save this file in a comma-separated value formatted file. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about automating this process. The Unanet development team did define an interface management utility a number of years ago, which is available for you to download from the Unanet support site, support.unanet.com. That support site does have a login area, so if you do not have a login to the support site, there is an area there to register for a login, and then you'll have access to go out and download this interface management utility. What this utility does essentially is a middleware between your external system and Unanet, which allows you to essentially take any CSV files that are in our format and then through an automated command line import using Windows Scheduler gives you the ability to import that data into Unanet and bypass that user interface. So the process works the same, but it's taking place behind the scenes and there's no manual intervention that's necessary. The interface management utility does include a log file process and an error reconciliation process. So we do print out or include as part of this file structure any errors of information that was unable to import due to the validation process. We do also have the ability to email those error logs out so that someone who's managing this interface can receive communication and be up to date and know what information is not importing. And the same information is available from an exporting process. You can have the interface management utility set up to export data out of Unanet automatically and then drop that off in a file location. And if you have another process then set up to pick up that file and import it into your other system, that would allow you to bring that data in. One of the services team members has recently created a video demonstration on the interface management utility. We will be sending out to you a webinar tips sheet after this webinar that includes a link to that demonstration video. It's about 15 minutes long, and it really goes through the entire process of configuring this interface management utility and scheduling it to run. So if you do want to have additional information about that utility and how it works, I would recommend that you do watch that video, and then please let us know if you have any further questions. The last thing that I'd like to talk about today before we go to our question and answer session is the MS Project interface. Holly mentioned that another item that our Unanet customers will use is the MS Project interface. So within the Unanet Project area, under the task list, we do have the ability for you to interface with Microsoft Project. Traditionally, what happens when you're using Microsoft Project interface is that you'll define within Microsoft Project your project plan. Okay, so if your project managers are using Microsoft Project, they'll build out their project plan as they do today. No changes there. They will be able to save that project plan then using a Unanet template. And when you have that Microsoft project plan saved in that template, you can use the project task area to import that Microsoft project plan into Unanet. The project manager of any project in Unanet does have the ability to integrate this information from Microsoft Project. They can integrate that data with or without the task dependencies. And essentially what the project interface accomplishes is it accomplishes building the work breakdown structure that you've defined within your project plan, including the dates, the duration of each task, into a Unanet task menu so that your Unanet employees can charge their time to those appropriate tasks as they're filling out their timesheet. Then we also have the ability to take those actual hours charged to the tasks within the work breakdown structure and integrate that back into Microsoft Project to update the actual hours worked fields within Microsoft Project. We do have a full help document available about the Microsoft Project interface, and including those templates that you'll need in order to load into Microsoft Project to save your project plan into the appropriate format to import that into Unanet.